Welcome to this new video in which I'll explain how to read and write data in a Google Sheet with Automa. Here's an example Google Sheet with two simple columns, column 1, column 2, and different values from 1 to 10 in the Google Sheet. So to read these values, I'll show you. I'm going to use the Google Sheets block in Automa. I'll choose the Get Spreadsheet Cell Values option, which corresponds to reading the Google Sheet. Next, I'll enter the ID of my Google Sheet, which I find in the URL of the Google Sheet after resize to edit. This is the Google Sheet ID. I can also use a variable to have a dynamic ID. Next, I define in this Google Sheet which sheet I'm targeting. In this case, sheet 1. This is the name here. And then which data range I'm targeting. Here I've put A, 2 points B. This means that I'm retrieving everything in columns A and B. I define a name for this Google Sheet configuration, a reference I call my sheet, which I'll use later. I check the use the first row as keys option. This is to enable me to use in a more intuitive way the data afterwards in the Google Sheet using the column labels correctly. Column labels. So call 1, call 2. To check that my configuration is correct, I click on Preview Data. A word of warning. If you have a dynamic ID here, it won't work as the variable has not yet been replaced by the value. You need to run the template so that variables are replaced by values. Preview Data. Voila. So it does read well the 2 columns of my Google Sheet. So there, I've done the job. Then, to use the data from the Google Sheet, data in my template, I'm going to use mustache syntax. So here in a variable I call sheet variable, I'm going to assign a value in the Google Sheet. I'm actually targeting this. So to target this data, the syntax is between doubles to collades. Google Sheets is the source of the data. In Automa, we have variable, we have global data, we have loops, etc. In this case, the source is a Google Sheet, period. Which Google Sheet? Well, it's the reference of the Google Sheet I created earlier, i.e. my sheet. Point 2 is the line number. Which number to use depends on whether or not you've ticked the use the first row as keys box. In other words, if you've checked it, the first row starts here, and if not, the first row starts here. In any case, the first row in a table is number 0. The same goes for the column. The first column is column 0. So in this case, I check the option. So to retrieve, well, this line here is line 2. So 0, we start here. 1, 2. So this is the line I'm going to get. So Google Sheets.mysheet.2 and call 1. So call 1, well, that allows me to target which column we're talking about. So that's what brings me here. Again, we wouldn't have checked the use the first row as keys box. That would be a number to enter. So I'll show you. There you go. In the variables, here we go. My variable, sheet variable, row 3. So that's exactly it. So you've seen how to retrieve precise data from a Google Sheet. Now we'll also look at how to create a loop, since the idea of a Google Sheet is also to, well, automatically read all the rows, all the data of the Google Sheet. So to do this, we're going to use a loop, which will read all rows and columns. We use a loop data block. We name this loop and give it an ID. So for example, I've named it loop sheet. The data source is a Google Sheet, which my sheet, the reference I created earlier, in the Google Sheet block here. And so, for example, here what I'm going to do is I'm going to open, in fact, a Google search with each of these values in column 1. That's all there is to it. So I'll show you. And voila, row 1, 2, 3, etc. As you can see, it worked very well. The loop has read all my lines automatically from the Google Sheet. So that's what I did to access the data. Here, we're still using mustache syntax, but this time the source of the data isn't Google Sheet, it's a loop. And the source in this case is called loop data. Which one? Loop sheet, as I named it just before. And I specify which column I want to use. So column 1. So here, in this case, it turns on the first column. And then what happens is that we enter the loop here. We then execute a series of actions in the loop. And here we come to the end of the loop with a loop breakpoint block, where you enter the ID of the loop in question. This allows Automa to know where the loop begins and ends. So when it gets there, as long as the loop hasn't ended, it will return to the beginning here, and it will repeat the whole series of actions you've included in the loop. Now, how does updating and writing to a Google Sheet work? So it's the same block, still Google Sheet, except that the option this time isn't get. Spreadsheet cell values, it's update spreadsheet cell values. The hard-coded Google Sheet ID, or dynamically with a variable. And we specify, in the same way as when reading, which sheets to target and which columns, which in any case, data ranges you want to update. That's all there is to it. And in fact, if you say to Thomas, what I've done is A to Z, that means that the Thomas will start from here. First line, first cell, A1, and copy and paste from there. If I had specified B to Z, in that case, well, it would have started from there. And then, what's the source of the update? It's either the Thomas table or custom data, in which you can enter either hard data, but in this case, it's not dynamic. It's not really of interest, except in certain cases. In this case, you can enter a variable or variables depending on the structure of your variables. As for writing in a Google Sheet, it's important to understand that Thomas will copy and paste the data you provide, which means that in reading, if you have 10 lines in your Google Sheet, at the end, in writing, you must also have 10 lines. Otherwise, it's going to create a time lag because, once again, at Thomas, it's just copying and pasting. So let's say we have these lines to process, i.e. 10 lines of data to process, and at the end of the process, this happens. That's it. So you see the problem. There's no longer row 3, and row 8 is gone too. They've disappeared, and that's because in your process, well, for some reason, you've excluded these rows from processing. In any case, you've excluded them from updating the Google Sheet, and so, well, as they no longer exist, well, by copying and pasting, Thomas only copies the rows and columns he has, which gives you this. So if you start with 10 rows and end up with 8, that's what happens. That's what happens. It creates an offset. This means that in your process, you need to think carefully about not to exclude any lines from the Google Sheet. So even if they're not actually supposed to be processed in your process, create a condition, make sure you still integrate them so that in the end, well, if you had 10 lines as input, you have 10 lines as output. Whatever the update method, whether using the Thomas table or custom data, the number of input and output lines must correspond. A concrete example, in application, I run the workflow, and there you have it. We've got a problem. We've got a time lag that's been created. Look closely. I have 10 input lines, except that in my Thomas table, whose values I can check in the logs, log, here. How many lines do I have? 8. And so what did Thomas do? He did this. Copy, paste. Which leads to what I was explaining earlier. You may find yourself confronted with a problem, an error linked to the Google Sheet API, which tells you that there's a problem with the quota, the writing, etc. You've overdone it for a minute. So if this happens, there are several solutions. There's a template building solution, or after that, different options that can help you get out of this problem. So I'm not going to show you everything, but basically, in broad outline, here you see what I do in my process. I process each line, and once here, in my example, my 10 lines have been processed. I update my Google Sheet once, whereas in some cases, you might be tempted to put it in the middle of the process. To update each line one by one, why not? But in this case, it means that instead of having one update action, you'll have 10. And so inevitably, you'll be exposing yourself to a higher risk of blocking related to the right quota. So first option. Another option is to use the other Google Sheet block. It's called Google Sheet Just Drive. It allows you, in effect, to connect to your Google account to have, how shall I say, higher permissions. Another option that I often use is to go to the block settings. Go to the On Error tab. Activate this option. By default, it's like this. So activate this option and activate the notion of retry. So what I tell him is to try the same action 3 times every 20 seconds. 3 times every 20 seconds. And since we have a quota in relation to a minute after 3 times 20 seconds, the minute is up. So logically, it's going to work in the end. That's how to use Google Sheet with Automa. Now it's up to you. You may not have understood everything. That's normal, I assure you. This wasn't a training video, but a demonstration. Because the aim of my training is to teach you how to master Automa progressively so that you'll be comfortable using all templates. Did you enjoy this video? Then please feel free to like, comment, and share it. That's what keeps me going. And if you have any ideas for templates for future videos, let me know in the comments. And of course, if you don't want to miss any future videos, subscribe to my channel.